Good morning, everybody. And glad to see you here today and see many of you here 2 days in a row. So this morning, Dr. Laura Lee is going to be sharing her teaching seminar with us. She's a candidate for the Conservation Science Assistant Professor faculty position. She earned her bachelor's in marine biology at Brown University, her master's in economics, and her PhD in environmental science and management at the Brennan School at UC Santa Barbara. She's currently a postdoc working in IONE with the direction of Skok. And so we're delighted to have you here today.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you all for coming. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about my teaching philosophy, then about potential contributions that I can make to the teaching and curriculum of the department, and then I'll do a mock lecture that would be part of a conservation science course or conservation decision-making course that's targeting decision-making tools to solve sustainability and conservation problems. So first, a big motivator for me as an educator is to develop future leaders in the field of conservation that understand science and can read and process and synthesize scientific information and use it to inform management decisions or other decisions that they might be making. As a mentor, I'm really eager to let students pursue their own interests and to equip them with the skills and tools that they might need or connections that they might need to do that. And in the classroom and also in my own research, my approach is interdisciplinary, and I love this quote by my current advisor, Steve Pulaski, that he said at the Natural Capital Project Symposium, which is that we no longer ask what discipline you're from because it's no longer relevant, but instead what skills and expertise and experience you can bring to solve problems. In the teaching that I do, I like to teach using examples, and hopefully you'll be able to see that in the mock lecture that I do today. And I think that's especially important when teaching quantitative courses and quantitative information. Examples are critical. And I also really like to do peer learning and problem solving in groups because I think it's important for students to learn how to work together even in informal classroom settings and communicate to each other as well, written and in oral form. So if I'm having a class that's around 25 people, I would encourage a lot of group projects that could even scale up to a class of 50 people to have these small group-oriented assignments. And last, I really think communication is critical, and I have some ideas for how that could be incorporated into courses, but also at the graduate level, how there could be more emphasis on scientific writing and presentations and so forth. And that is important as a skill no matter what field that we go into. So in terms of teaching contributions at the undergrad level, I could contribute to existing fish and wildlife and ESPM courses, including the human dimensions of biological conservation, ecology of managed systems, fisheries ecology management, principles of conservation biology, or even the marine biology minor. So that could be a very unexpected thing to be teaching marine biology in the middle of Minnesota, but I do have a background in marine biology. I could also, and would be very excited to develop new courses in either program, but one could be, for instance, ecosystem services from theory to practice, conservation science that would take a broad perspective of not only ecology and conservation biology, but economics, different policies of management, social sciences, and decision theory. I could teach a more quantitative conservation course, like risk assessment or decision-making in conservation that would emphasize techniques like conservation planning and prioritization, but also statistical techniques that are important in risk assessment. And then to expand courses in the marine biology minor, I would be excited to teach a course on marine conservation, which would complement the current course on Introduction to Marine Biology. So those are just some ideas. And to go into one of the ideas in more detail to see how So you can see how I might approach it. I'm going to talk about some ideas in particular for the ecosystem services course. So I would like to cover in that course going from the scientific underpinnings of ecosystem services, but then covering new policy initiatives in that area, and then teaching the students real-world applications of ecosystem service concepts using various case studies, and then also introducing them to some of the tools to actually do these ecosystem service assessments that are currently being used in various decision-making contexts. And for instance, we could do something with Invest, which has a home and Institute on the Environment with a natural capital project, so that would really take advantage of that expertise here on campus, or other planning tools like Marksan. So that would be great for a course with about 25 to 30 students where we could have a computer lab components too, or possibly more students with multiple labs. In terms of new programs, I am interested in expanding the current mentorship network program with the Fish and Wildlife graduates. Right now I'm involved in Brown University's Women's Launchpad Mentorship Program, where I have a mentee that I talk with every few weeks, and I give her career advice, and it can be informal, just checking in, or also I help her with her job applications, interview prep, CV. And I think that this type of model for a conservation program would be, or wildlife fisheries program would be great, because it's such a rapidly changing field, and it's hard for faculty to know exactly what the new opportunities are, also what skills are needed, and also what connections might be out there. So I think strengthening the alumni network and pairing alumni with rising seniors might be a good strategy. I know that this has been really successful at Brown, the program that I'm involved in. And there was a lot of interest from alumni and students. Another idea that I mentioned yesterday is to have another arm of the master's program that would be a more of a non-academic track to pair master's student research projects with stakeholders or clients, where they would complete a project in collaboration with an agency or an NGO, or even potentially industry, and that product would come out at the end, and that could prepare students that might not be interested in academic careers. They could still have a strong, rigorous research component that would be developed in, with faculty, but it would give them some other skills and connections that they might not get if they're doing a traditional thesis. And I was involved in programs like that at the Bren School. The students there do actually master's group projects that are about 1.5 years long, and they pair with different NGOs, stakeholders, businesses, and work together throughout that whole process. And then the end product is whatever product they need, but also a thesis report. And this has also been a great opportunity to leverage funding for students and to teach them these, at least in the group context, these softer skills about how to work with different personalities, how to engage with a client or a stakeholder, and that was very collaborative. And I'm not necessarily suggesting the group aspect of that, because that has the free rider problem, but I think it still is an interesting model and could also attract students that might not pursue a traditional master's in fish, wildlife, and conservation. So it might expand diversity in the students that would be attracted to the department. At the graduate level, I'm interested in exploring opportunities for research or project-based courses where students would work together in a seminar to come up with a project, and then that would result in a paper that would continue throughout the year. And this is another opportunity for students to gain softer skills, again, like working in groups, project management, but it also creates an avenue to have discussions about ethics in academia, authorship, and these types of discussions that don't actually happen enough in graduate school. I could also teach various skills-based courses, like regression analysis of environmental and social data sets, or bioeconomic modeling for resource management. And I'd be excited to co-teach interdisciplinary seminars with people in applied economics or forest resources, for example. That could be tapping into the existing conservation biology course, or creating a new course that might be, for instance, climate change adaptation from a biological and economic perspective. And as I mentioned, I'd be excited to develop a communications course that could, for instance, draw on Josh Schimmel's book, Writing Science, or Nancy Barron's book, which is Escape from the Ivory Tower, that has useful tools like the message box, where you're forced to write down what's the issue, what's the problem, why is this important, what are the benefits of studying this problem, and what are the potential solutions. And it's really hard to do. Probably we all should do this more, myself included, but I think it's a really effective way to start to think about how to communicate what you're working on to a broader audience and why it's important. And that's just one example of the types of techniques that are in some of these books that we can draw. So I'm going to do an example lecture from a course that might be more focused on 300 to 500 level in conservation science and decision theory. And this is just throwing out some ideas for an outline, but the lecture is going to really be targeted at approaches for decision making. So a course might have conservation science overview, conservation challenges, how we actually can measure conservation outcomes, and what are some conservation objectives, both in policy and at the state level. And then going through approaches to aid in conservation planning and decision making, which again this would be focused on, and then new policy solutions, management solutions, and frontiers. So today I'll be talking about decision-making tools to solve conservation problems, and this would be the first lecture on structured decision-making. That would be over the course of several lectures, but an introduction to structured decision-making. And the reading would be a paper that I'm going to draw on heavily as an example throughout the lecture for this class. And the main takeaway from this lecture is that a formalization of common sense for decision problems, which are too complex for informal use of common sense. And so the skills from this lecture are to start to think about how to formalize decision problems, how to think ahead about the consequences to taking different management actions, and how we compare a sequence of actions. So again, conservation problems fall in the range of problems that are too complicated for common sense. They are characterized by a lot of complexity and uncertainty. We have limited resources to manage our natural resources and to conserve species. There's a lot of really difficult judgment calls and really diverse stakeholder values, but growing expectations from stakeholders to deliver on our outcomes for conservation and wildlife. And there's really a lot of high stakes involved because we could lose valuable resources that will no longer be available for future generations. So in this first introduction to structured decision making, we're going to consider two classes of environmental decision problems, both with a single management objective, with and without uncertainty. And when I say objective, I just mean what do we actually care about and what do we value. And when I say uncertainty, it means things that we don't know. So I'm going to introduce structured decision making, but with a kind of strange but very interesting and complicated problem, which is the invasion of a myrtle rust fungus in Australia. And the myrtle rust is pictured here. It was first documented and noticed in New South Wales, Australia in 2010. And a government task force, as soon as this was identified, was starting to put together to figure out, is this actually a problem? This is a non-native species in Australia. Is it going to spread? And what might the ecological and economic consequences be? So myrtle rust is a complex issue because when it was spotted, the abundance of this fungus was not known. What was known was that this fungus could be spread really easily. It produces a really large amount of small spores. It could be moved through infected plant materials like nursery stocks or plant cuttings, also through contaminated equipment that's touched it, wind, water, humans, animals, vehicles. So to actually contain this rust is actually going to be a very complicated problem that involves potentially regulation, controlling human movement, quarantine, and the actual effects of the myrtle rust are unknown in Australian ecosystems, but what is known is that the myrtle rust impacts several important tree species like eucalyptus, willow, bottlebrush, and you can see from this picture those are the dominant species in these forests, and they support a lot of wildlife as well as industries. So the potential ecological impacts are tree death, especially for young trees, also changes in the ecological community and habitat for wildlife. And if treated with chemicals, the potential side effects of the fungicide could impact other plants or animals. And another option for treatment is to actually just remove the infected plants. On the economic side, this is a real concern for forestry and tree plantations, agriculture, horticulture, and tourism, because let's face it, it's pretty ugly. Looks like an open wound. So I ask everyone, what do you recommend doing about this problem? What are some potential options, and what do you suggest?
Maybe something like quarantining areas?
Yeah.
Destroy all infected plants?
Yeah.
Figure out the most important means of spread.
So which one of these things should we do? So this is where we go into structured decision making, because it's important to have a transparent and systematic process to make these decisions, because probably different stakeholders and different groups have their own idea of what's the best strategy to take. So the steps of structured decision making follow this PROACT, which is a very cheesy acronym, but easy to remember the different steps. So the first part is to identify the problem and to really break the problem into different components. So we're separating the actual problem and objectives and values from the science in this case. Objectives, again, are what we value, as we've discussed before, and the objective will drive the rest of the analysis. So figuring out an objective can be very hard, and it involves engaging diverse sets of stakeholders so all of the objectives are clearly defined. Then we'll think about what can we actually do about this problem? What are our management alternatives? What are they going to cost? And then we'll assess the consequences of taking each of these actions for our objective or outcome of interest, and then think about trade-offs and actually optimization, given that we're in a world where we have constrained resources and different values. And then finally, we'll make a decision. No problem, right? So the first part is actually defining the problem. And in the process of the paper that we read, in order to define the problem, the group put together a focus group of 15 stakeholders to actually scope the problem, consult people, identify what other stakeholders might need to be involved. And then part of this process is to think about the decision being made. So are we going to quarantine? Are we going to do nothing? Are we going to employ a chemical? And then thinking about what triggered the decision and why it matters. So in Australia, there's very, very strong invasive species policies. And to go through and consider the legal and policy context, are there legal constraints that are defining the problem? Who's going to make a decision ultimately? And who are the stakeholders we might care about?
You said that you put together this stakeholder group of folks from 15 people. How important is it to get multiple groups potentially? I mean, could there be some kind of group dynamics that yield certain outcomes that might not happen in another group? Does that happen, or is it usually just one focus group in this kind of situation?
So in this paper that I'm drawing on for this myrtle rust example, yeah. So they did an initial scoping phase where they got together 15 people. Then they identified who the critical stakeholders were based on that other input. So then invited 60 people. Some were scientists, some were from the plant industries, some were from the federal, state level, and territory level government, some were non-native species managers. So trying to get as many as possible, and then only 24 actually came to the final consultation out of the 60, but to engage as many different people as possible that have interest in the problem. And of course, who's in the room might drive what objectives you choose or what alternatives you go with, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So who, in this case, who might we want to contact?
All the people you just mentioned.
Yeah. Fair enough. For the problem, in this context, they were trying to identify where the rust had established, how far it had spread, and what host plants were currently being infected. But also, because it was initially locally contained, they wanted to know the probability that it was going to spread more regionally and to other states to see how many different groups were going to need to be involved to actually contain this problem. So the next step is setting clear objectives, and with a clear objective, you can hear the concerns of the different stakeholders. So we're worried about losing money from forestry because of this, or an environmental concern might be that the trees are going to die and they're an important habitat for wildlife and they're going to change the ecosystem. Or concerns could be about the actual management action that might be employed, which is that the fungicide could harm people and animals. But it's important to then take these concerns and translate them into something that can be measured and also quantified. So losing money from forestry means let's minimize the cost to industry. That's an actual objective of minimizing. And then for environmental concerns, these can be summarized as minimizing the impact on ecosystems. So these are the two objectives that we're going to be thinking about, and then considering all of the outcomes relative to these two objectives. So what are some options for management actions to achieve these two objectives specifically? Nothing? Say it again. What are the alternatives for these two objectives? So there might be other things that we might consider, but they are not going to help us achieve our objectives. Well, I can tell you the ones that they considered in this actual problem. An important step of this process is to think through all of the possible alternatives, even if they're really just kind of out there and wonky, and because then we can actually evaluate each of them and then compare across the different outcomes that we would expect from taking each action. So the first action is just doing nothing, which is definitely the least costly from a management perspective, but could have huge damages to the environment and to industry. Another option is just to live with it and mitigate the impacts, so cutting off infected materials and destroying them. Another would be slowing the spread by trying to actually quarantine, but that would be pretty difficult in this problem just given how easily the spores can move. Then there's partial eradication with some combination of a fungicide and plant removal, and then full eradication, which might be difficult again because it's going to be hard to detect whether or not this fungus has spread to the areas. So the next step is to then evaluate the expected consequences for each action relative to the objective. And this is a step that we're going to go into in more detail because there's several different ways that you can do this. Approaches might be to survey experts, and they draw on their knowledge of what they think might happen. Also literature review of what's happened when you've taken these actions in other contexts. And then you could do very complex or very simple models and simulations to have a system model to then simulate what you might expect to happen. So in the paper we read, they did an expert opinion survey, and depending on what your time frame might be or constraints and the time to when the decision needs to be made, that might also dictate which of these approaches you do. Because it's still better to have expert opinion and literature review than no consideration of the consequences of the action. But if time permits, it might be better to actually have a full model analysis of what the consequences might be. So this could be its own course on its own. But we'll go into more details and examples later in the course. So first we're going to consider the consequences for the objective of minimizing costs. So here are each of our alternatives: doing nothing, living with it, slowing the spread, partial and full eradication. And then here are the ranges of potential costs to industry that the experts identified. And you can see that the two best options from the industry cost minimization objective is to, let's see, live with it or slow the spread.
So somebody's expert opinion was that the second and the third had costs that were 75% of the first, fourth, and fifth.
Yeah, but the group, so in total, that's probably why there's such a big range in estimates too. Then the next objective is the effect on the ecosystem and minimizing environmental damage. And here that's measured as the number of species that could be infected in Australia. And that's down here. And again, they identified living with it and slowing the spread as the best alternatives. So that might be actually rare, though, that when you have multiple objectives, the same actions are the ones that are going to yield the best outcome. So later in the course, we're going to think about what happens when you have trade-offs among multiple objectives and how you can optimize your management decisions when you have multiple considerations. And here's an example here where we have environmental impacts on the y-axis and costs on the x-axis. And each of these dots is a hypothetical management action and where it would get you in terms of environmental damage and costs. So here you can see the highest cost option has the least impact on the environment. So if we only cared about environmental impact and cost wasn't an issue or a consideration, that's the option that we choose. However, if it was the opposite and we wanted the least cost alternative, that would be up here. So we have the lowest costs but high environmental impact. And then this is somewhere in between if we cared about them both equally. And so this is what's called an efficiency frontier, because as you can see, there are no management actions that will get you better in terms of lowering costs or lowering environmental impact. But then we also have some suboptimal alternatives. So here is a management action where for the same cost, we can actually get lower environmental impact. So why would we ever choose these options? So going through this transparent process can at least reveal what alternatives are going to be suboptimal, and we're always going to try to be on this efficiency frontier. Yeah?
You know, this is a cartoon. How do you actually quantify those things?
Yeah, so I have some examples at the end, but it's actually often done in spatial land management. So you'll look at your different objectives and then say you're going to zone different activities in different areas, like protected areas or agriculture or different land uses, and then compare which each of those spatial scenarios would give you in terms of the objectives. And then you can plot them on a surface and then find the efficiency frontier. And that's something
how do you know how effective any of those are going to be? You just sort of...
It's modeling. Yeah, you can incorporate uncertainty, but yeah, it's the best available science to assess what those consequences might be. So that's a sneak peek into what we will think about later. And the next part of the course today is thinking about a single objective but with uncertainty. So now we're going to consider minimizing costs from damages and the fact that we don't actually know if this rust is going to spread or not. So what should we do? But before we go back into the rust example, let's think of a potentially more relevant example, which is the fact that in this course you could have a pop quiz. And there's uncertainty over which state of the world we're going to be in. Is there going to be a pop quiz or not? So given those two events, there's two things that you could do to prepare for this potential outcome. You could do the reading, or not do the reading. And these are the two different action strategies. So if you do the reading and there is a pop quiz, you can understand the kind of consequences of that, which is that you're sad because there's a pop quiz. If you do the reading and there is no pop quiz, you're also sad because you've done the reading and there was no pop quiz. If you don't do the reading and there is a pop quiz, you're really sad. And if you don't do the reading and there's no pop quiz, you're indifferent, so it's 0. So we could actually, in some cases and for some problems, put a dollar value on that or a number on the outcome. And as we've discussed in other parts of the course, sometimes we don't want to be doing evaluation and it's controversial, and we might want to remain in a world where we're just considering sad faces. But if you can actually put dollar amounts on it, you could also consider which strategy we should take and which payoff is the one that we want to get. So which strategy would you choose based on this problem? Not an option.
It depends on how frequently
The probability of a pop
gives
quiz.
pop quiz.
Yes, perfect. So that, yeah. And a critical part of this is how often there's going to be pop quizzes. So let's assume at the start of the course I said 1 in 10 courses there's going to be a pop quiz. So there's a 10% chance of a quiz in any given class. So we can actually then figure out what's the best strategy to take given these odds by constructing an expected value. So first we're going to evaluate the expected payoff from this strategy of reading and then from the strategy of not reading given the probability of these two events occurring. So when we actually compute an expected value, we're considering that we have a 10% chance of losing $3, a 90% chance of losing $3, which means an expected loss of $3. In this case, we have a 10% chance of losing $90 plus 0, and that's losing $9. So it's clear when you go through this structured process that the best strategy is doing the reading. Just a good lesson. But now we can consider this problem with our favorite Myrtle Rust problem about whether or not we should start eradication measures in new areas or not. And that's applying the fungicide. So what information do we need to know in order to make this decision?
Negative consequences on non-target species.
And the chances of it spreading.
Yeah. So in this case, we're trying to avoid damages, but we also need to know the management cost of taking each action and also the probability of spread. So in this case, we're just considering eradicating or not, and we're considering two states of the world, which is the spread or not. So here we have the damages if the invasion occurs and we do nothing, and then the management costs. So we haven't paid anything, but if the invasion occurs, we're going to have losses of 5 million, for instance. I've made up these numbers. If the invasion occurs and we eradicate, then we have incurred management costs, but let's assume eradication is successful, so we've avoided other damages. Then we have a case where the invasion does not happen. And in this case, if we do not eradicate and it doesn't occur, no management costs, no damages. But if we do manage and eradicate and the invasion does not occur, we've lost a lot of money in terms of management costs. Oh, and here I'm considering a situation where there's an 80% chance of the invasion occurring because this Myrtle Rust can spread so easily, so there's a pretty high likelihood based on previous locations. So now, should we act to eradicate or not, given this information?
Yes, we should eradicate.
Yes, we should eradicate. So we can do that same process, where we're going to compute our expected value. So 0.8 times -2 plus 0.2 times -2 minus 2 million. And here we have, ooh, that should be 5. So now we might have a more complicated decision, because in reality, we're constantly making decisions, and the sequence of decisions might actually matter a lot when we're making multiple decisions. And now we're considering a case where there's another option where we can monitor the rust and see if it's starting to spread, and then decide whether or not to act. So again, we're considering minimizing the costs of both management and damages, and considering 2 actions and also the sequence of these actions: to monitor, or just go ahead and act now, or so those are the 2 actions: monitor or not, and thinking about the consequences again in terms of dollars of damages. So this is a very useful tool, which is a decision tree, where we're going to actually write out all the possible consequences of taking these actions, given whether or not an invasion has occurred, so we can actually find the best strategy that's robust to whatever outcome might happen. And these are just some of the numbers. We're considering damages to be 10 million, probability of invasion to be 50%, 0.5. So the first decision that we're going to make is whether or not we're going to monitor. And the way that we represent this in a decision tree is that the actions are squares and followed by green lines. Then we have the random events that might occur, and those are these blue circles and then these dotted lines. So here we could choose to monitor, and then the invasion could happen with some probability or not happen with some probability. The other option that we were considering is not monitoring, just going ahead and eradicating like we did before. And then we have another action here, and it's acting or not acting. So here we're doing nothing. This is our doing nothing strategy. Not monitoring, not acting, and the invasion could still occur or not. Here we're acting right away, and the invasion could occur or not. So in this case, we risk potentially acting, and then there being no invasion, and paying management costs for no reason. In this case, we've chosen to monitor first, so we can observe whether or not the invasion has happened, and then decide whether to act or not act based on that information. And in this case, it seems maybe a little trivial to say that there was no invasion and to consider acting or not, but again, we want to consider the consequences of each possible alternative, and then figure out what the outcomes would be in terms of the management costs and damages, and then figure out the opportunity or the option that minimizes that, and then work backwards. So in this case, if we've monitored and then acted, we're paying the cost of monitoring and the cost of acting, but we're avoiding damages because that's what we've assumed. If we monitor and the invasion occurs and then we haven't acted, we're paying the cost of monitoring and then the damages. In this case, we're monitoring and there's no invasion, so we can act or not act. And again, those are the resulting costs that would occur from taking those actions. Yeah.
But so in the case of monitoring and acting versus the case of not monitoring and acting, it seems like the latter case, where you're just acting right away, that has to be cheaper than monitoring and then acting later, because you're necessarily waiting for it to start spreading before you're acting. So the cost has to be more, right? To act at that point. Plus you have the cost of monitoring. But the CA is not equal, I guess, is my point.
Yeah. It ends up being that, but
okay.
I'll talk through that, yeah.
Okay.
And then in this case, we're just acting, and I'll just what James just said, or not acting and then incurring the damages. So, but you might consider a case too where the doing nothing could be a good strategy if the probability that the rust is not going to spread is high enough, for instance. But again, when there's randomness here involved, we actually need to consider the expected value. So the way to use these decision trees is to start backwards for each branch and then figure out what's the best outcome, and then work our way back to say, okay, if we had taken all these actions and invasion had occurred, what would the best thing be? What if it didn't occur? What would it be? What's the expected value of taking that sequence of actions? So let's start with this case down here, the expected costs from not monitoring. So if we act, we're going to incur the cost of CA, which is 2 million, because we have one outcome where the invasion occurs and one where it doesn't, so that's our expected value from not monitoring, just acting. If we don't act, can you see down here?
So you're assuming that P is 0.5?
Yeah. So if we don't act, then our expected costs here is the probability invasion times the damages plus the probability of no invasion times 0, which just equals the probability times the damages. So because the damages are 10 million, sorry, this pen is not working. Well, I'll just have to say, because neither of these pens are working. This strategy is going to cost 5 million, where the strategy of just acting is only 2 million. So clearly, acting is the best thing to do when you're not monitoring.
But if we go back to the idea of the decision frontier, the efficiency frontier, you set this up in the first example with a 0.8 probability. Now you're using a 0.5 probability.
Yeah.
So as that probability changes, things float from the suboptimal down to the efficiency frontier. So choosing that or understanding better what that probability is controls everything.
Well, the efficiency frontier example was an example with no uncertainty. So there were no probabilities there. That was assuming that those outcomes were known with certainty. And then this is the case where we don't know the outcome with certainty. If that makes sense. And then the other thing that we can evaluate is the expected costs with monitoring. So in this case, we're considering that we've chosen to monitor, and then what happens if the invasion occurs, or what happens if the invasion does not occur. So if the invasion occurs, then we have these options of acting or not acting. So if it occurs, we have acting. So the cost of monitoring, then the cost of acting. Or we have the cost of monitoring and the damages, because we're considering this case where the invasion has occurred, and we're assuming that had happened. And you can see that because the cost of damages are higher than the cost of acting, the best strategy is to act if the invasion occurs. If the invasion does not occur, we have the cost of monitoring compared to the cost of monitoring versus the cost of acting. And clearly the cost of just monitoring is going to be lower than the cost of monitoring plus acting. So if the invasion does not occur, we should not act. But because we don't know whether or not the invasion is going to occur or not, we have to consider the expected costs of taking each of those. So then our expected cost is going to be the probability of the invasion occurring times the probability of monitoring plus cost plus the probability of it not occurring times the cost of monitoring. And then we get some expected cost. So, as James pointed out without me having to do this, the expected cost with monitoring is going to be the cost of monitoring times the probability of the invasion occurring and then needing to act. And the expected cost with not monitoring is just going to be the cost of acting, which is going to be lower. And so going through this process and looking at all the consequences of each sequence of action, we can identify that acting now is going to be better than monitoring and then choosing whether or not to act. And that's going to depend, of course, on the different costs, the potential damages and the estimates of those damages, but also, as Jim pointed out, the probability of the event, like an invasion occurring. And we're going to practice some of these problems in the homework, so this is just really an introduction to decision trees, but it's a useful process to go through when you're making sequential actions. And so you can just work backwards from that in a systematic way. So what actually happened with the rust? When the myrtle rust was first detected, they initiated a response to eradicate the rust. But the response was unsuccessful because the spores were dispersing too quickly by the wind. And so eradications were abandoned, and then they transitioned to mitigation and management. And this is just one introduction to a topic that we're going to cover later in the section of the course, which is adaptive management, where you implement an action and observe what happens, and then with that new information, you can update your next management decisions to make better choices. So to continue on this theme for the homework, and continuing with the rust theme apparently, we're going to be doing a problem on the threat of rusty crayfish invasion to Iowa and other areas in Minnesota. And this crayfish is invasive, and it's spreading to lakes, rivers, and streams in several areas of North America. These are more aggressive than the native crayfish and better able to avoid fish predation. They can harm native fish populations by eating their eggs and young, and displace and hybridize with native crayfish and eliminate aquatic plants. And so for further reading to introduce you to this problem, I've provided a link here and in the homework. And what I want you to do is to go through the first steps of PROACT and define the objectives that might be useful to consider here, potential management alternatives, and consequences, and then to come to class with a recommendation of an action. And then in class, you'll be brought together in small groups where you're going to actually have to debate which management action you should take. Because definitely the trickiest part of this whole problem is that people have diverse values and might prefer different alternatives given how they weight different objectives. And so part of this process will be bargaining and trying to work together in a group to make a recommendation considering these potential trade-offs. So in summary, this lecture provided an introduction to structured decision-making, which we're going to be building on in the next parts of the course. And I introduced topics of uncertainty and how to construct expected values, and also provided an introduction to decision trees. In the next lecture, we'll be considering multiple objectives and trade-off analysis when we have diverse stakeholder values. And this would be an example of a potential reading for trade-off analysis. Thanks, Laura. Questions?
I've got lots of questions about this. So I'm really curious about in practice, I mean, this is obviously just a toy example for the lecture, but this is actually rolled out in the real world. And you have, people are making valuations, and I might think that your force is worth $1 million, you might think it's worth $10 million. And so there's going to be some arguing about that. And I suspect, I mean, I can understand you can play with different numbers in terms of like how much it costs to mine or how much what the damages are. But at some point, they're based on who wins an argument, or you could have this go either way. I can imagine it quite easily sort of the optimal solution depending on how you set your valuation. You
Yeah.
can go multiple ways. And so when you get in that kind of situation, how do you resolve it?
So this is really more of a tool to make transparent decisions and to avoid suboptimal outcomes. So one thing that I had, oh, whoops, here is an example where you might have multiple ecosystem services. So one might be fish biomass, and then the other might be profits. And each of the actions might be choosing which fishing areas to close or not. And we can identify the best sets of actions, but we found the best set of actions and which actions we actually take are totally dependent on which value you weight more. So if this is conservation and you care about conservation, you might want this outcome. But if you're caring about profits, you might want this outcome. You might be able to compromise. But the point is, this is a transparent process, so you're never going to pick any of the options down here because one of you could do better.
But I guess the follow-up on that, though, is I understand this makes a lot of sense to me, but it seems like by changing the number, you get different curves. You get a different efficiency frontier.
Right, absolutely.
And so how do you deal with that? Like figuring out what number you actually put in and make that graph. That seems like that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of making these models. And if you can get wildly different outcomes.
There's uncertainty in the probability of something happening, but a lot of uncertainty in the numbers and costs.
Right.
Is that what you're getting at, sort of?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's now more complicated approaches to this where you can incorporate uncertainty, and the problem is that you don't, at least I wouldn't put that in this level of a course because you don't really get a frontier, you get this like multi-dimensional surface that's, not as clear. But people are using the structured decision making, and I think that the example that I used with the rust was actually done in Australia. And I think the point is that it's better that people are talking about this and having a transparent and systematic process than not, because you have to clearly define all of these assumptions rather than making a decision without clearly articulating what those assumptions are. And of course the answer is going to be dependent on some of the values and assumptions, but at least it's like a systematic way of doing it. Yeah.
Having participated in some of this, I can tell you that personality matters a lot. Not just the mix of stakeholders, but the mix of personalities. And has there been much research on that aspect of it and how that can affect an outcome?
Yeah, there's been some. I'm not completely up to speed on that literature, but definitely in the fields of decision science and operations research where this was developed. Yeah.
I have a teaching question. So when you prepared the lecture today, what part of it did you think was going to be the most difficult to do your job as a teacher? And then did we respond in the way that you had expected? In other words, the part that you thought was most challenging to probably teach today, did we seem most confused, or what's your sort of sense of kind of what were the tricky parts of the lecture?
For me, I think the decision tree, because I have a tendency to talk too quickly, and so I worry that I could lose people in the steps. Probably, I would, after this, prepare with more diverse sets of examples of going through this process, like thinking about people's personalities, maybe include some other examples of outcomes or successes or failures or applications. Yeah.
Imagining that service 2 was something really, anthropocentric. The word feed a timber, service number 1 is biodiversity. Can you imagine an audience of students that have very different values? One that would only value axis 1, other students only value axis 2. How could this be a useful tool to, help them compromise? Could it be a useful tool?
I think that part of the exercise that I was planning for the next class was just to have people to have those discussions and to think, to walk through that process as a starting point to talk about some of those differences. And I think that it is a useful tool because it's, again, a transparent process where you have to be really clear about your objective and how that's informed by value.
So arguments maybe about where you want to be on the efficiency frontier are all about values, but it's a tool to rule out all those red options as things that we want to consider.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get the crowd arguing about, is it worth 10% of your biomass to save 90% of your species with this group?
So we have a class here called conflict resolution, so I feel like this would be a great introduction. So after you learn how to do stuff like structured decision making, go into the class and learn how to resolve these kind of issues when people have completely different values, like finding the best alternatives, like reaching an agreement, and just move on from there.
Yeah, so that would be great if I knew about that, to kind of say if you're interested in this, to think about taking that class, or something like environmental negotiations, which is definitely outside of the scope of what I would feel comfortable teaching, but it's good to point out students to different resources.
Other questions?
I have a general teaching question on this. How would you deal with students? Like, one of the things I struggle with is the heterogeneity in the student population in terms of who's their background and experiences that we're talking about today. How would you deal with admittedly, these are sometimes brain benders in terms of thinking about how this stuff works. How would you deal with students that might not be quite getting it?
Well, I think repetition, holding extra office hours to spend some more time going through and breaking down the concepts in a smaller group. I also think that doing these group homework assignments is helpful, because there's some opportunity for peer learning and more repetition. So those are just some strategies, but it sounds like even that might need some other thinking depending on the level of the students and what courses they've taken before. So I'd probably also go and talk with people in the department from our experience with the student body.
Any other questions? Thanks, Laura. Okay.